Hey everyone, ever wonder when Canada really came into its own? Let's talk about the 1960s, a decade that completely reshaped the nation. Before the 60s, we were still flying a version of the British flag. But in 1965, the iconic maple leaf was born, a symbol of a new independent Canadian identity. This was the era of big ideas. Universal Medicare became a reality, giving everyone access to health care. The Quiet Revolution was sparking a cultural awakening in Quebec, and a new points-based immigration system in 1967 opened the doors to the world. The climax? Expo 67 in Montreal. It was a massive World's Fair where Canada proudly showed off its innovation and multicultural spirit. The 1960s weren't just a decade. They were the foundation of the modern, diverse, and socially conscious Canada we know today. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more Canadian history. The 1960s, a decade of revolution, change, and rock and roll. While much of the world was in turmoil, Canada was quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, forging a new identity. Forget the quiet, polite Canada you think you know. The 60s were when the nation truly came of age, stepping out from the shadow of the British Empire and the United States to declare its own unique place in the world. It was a decade of bold ideas, cultural awakenings, and a new sense of what it meant to be Canadian. From a new flag that sparked fierce debate to a World's Fair that dazzled the globe, the 1960s were a whirlwind. So, how did this decade of transformation set the stage for the modern, diverse Canada we know today? Let's rewind the clock and find out. Before the 60s, Canada often felt like it was living in someone else's house. Our flag, the red ensign, literally had another country's flag in the corner. Our national anthem was "God Save the Queen," but a new generation was rising, one that didn't just want to be a British Dominion or America's friendly northern neighbor. They wanted something of their own. The feeling was palpable in the factories, on the farms, and in the rapidly growing cities. The post-war boom was in full swing. People had jobs, they were building families, and there was a sense of optimism in the air. For many working folks, life was about providing for your family. Sure, but also about building a better country. There was a feeling that we were on the cusp of something big, that our hard work was creating a nation with its own destiny. This simmering desire for a distinct identity exploded onto the national stage in 1964 with the Great Canadian Flag Debate. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson was determined to give Canada a flag that was uniquely Canadian. It sounds simple, right? Wrong. It was one of the most bitter and divisive debates in Canadian history. Traditionalists, especially veterans who fought under the red ensign, felt it was a betrayal of our heritage. Others saw it as a necessary step forward, a symbol of a new independent nation. The debate raged in Parliament and in living rooms across the country. But on February 15, 1965, the new maple leaf flag was raised over Parliament Hill for the first time. It was a powerful moment. For the first time, Canada had a symbol that was entirely its own, instantly recognizable and belonging to no one else. The simple, elegant maple leaf became a banner for a new kind of Canadian pride. While the country was debating its symbols, it was also redefining its social contract. This was the era when Medicare, a cornerstone of Canadian identity, truly took root. Saskatchewan had led the way, but it was in the 1960s that the federal government, under Pearson, laid the groundwork for a national, universal healthcare system. The Medical Care Act of 1966 established the principle that every Canadian, regardless of their income or where they lived, should have access to medical care. This wasn't just a policy, it was a statement of values. It said that in Canada, we take care of each other. This idea of a social safety net, of collective responsibility, became deeply embedded in the Canadian psyche during this decade, setting us on a different path from our southern neighbor. Nowhere was the spirit of change more electrifying than in Quebec. The 1960s saw the beginning of the Quiet Revolution, or Revolution Tranquille. For decades, Quebec had been a largely rural, conservative society dominated by the Catholic Church. But suddenly, everything changed. A new generation of French-speaking Quebecers, educated and ambitious, demanded control over their own destiny. As a student in Montreal at the time, the city was buzzing with energy. We were reading new books, debating new ideas in cafes, and questioning everything. The government took control of education and healthcare from the church, nationalized the province's hydroelectric power under the rallying cry, Mater chez nous, masters in our own house. It was a profound cultural and political awakening. This wasn't about separating from Canada, not yet anyway. It was about affirming our language, our culture, and our place as a modern, distinct society within the Canadian Federation. The Quiet Revolution reshaped Quebec, and in doing so, reshaped the entire country, forcing all of Canada to grapple with its dual language identity. The face of Canada was also literally changing. In 1967, the country introduced a radical new approach to immigration, the point system. Before this, immigration policy was often discriminatory, favoring immigrants from Britain and Western Europe. The new system was revolutionary because it was colorblind. It awarded points based on things like education, job skills, and language ability, not on race or country of origin. For someone like me, arriving in Canada during this time, it felt like a promise. It was a message that Canada wasn't just a club for certain kinds of people. It was a country that valued you for what you could contribute, for your skills and your ambition. This policy opened the doors to people from all over the world, from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and laid the foundation for the multicultural mosaic that defines Canada today. It was a bold step, a conscious decision to build a diverse and inclusive nation. Of course, no story of the 1960s is complete without the earthquake. Just like everywhere else, Canada had its own counterculture. Young people were growing their hair long, listening to new kinds of music, from folk icons like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young to rock bands like The Guess Who, and questioning the values of their parents' generation. It was the rise of a distinct Canadian youth culture, one that was less about imitating the U.S. and more about creating its own sound and style. This generational shift wasn't just about fashion and music. It was about a new way of thinking, more skeptical of authority, more passionate about social justice, and more hopeful about building a peaceful world. This energy fueled movements for peace, environmentalism, and civil rights across the country. And then came the big party. 1967 was Canada's 100th birthday, and the country celebrated in style. The centennial was a year-long cross-country celebration, but its glittering centerpiece was the 1967 International and Universal Exposition in Montreal. Better known as Expo 67, the theme was Man and His World, and it was a spectacle unlike anything Canada had ever seen. The city was transformed with futuristic pavilions, like Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, and a monorail that whisked visitors through a vision of the future. Over 50 million people came from all over the globe, and for 6 months, Montreal was the most exciting city on the planet. Expo 67 was more than just a fair. It was Canada's coming-out party. It showed the world, and perhaps more importantly, showed Canadians themselves that we were a modern, confident, creative, and forward-looking nation, capable of achieving great things on the world stage. The optimism was infectious. The song, A Place to Stand, A Place to Grow, became an unofficial anthem, capturing the spirit of a country that was finally comfortable in its own skin. However, it's crucial to acknowledge that this story of progress and awakening wasn't shared by everyone. For Indigenous peoples in Canada, the 1960s were a continuation of a long history of colonialism and oppression. While the rest of Canada was celebrating, Indigenous communities were dealing with the devastating legacy of residential schools and discriminatory policies. The 1969 White Paper proposed by the Trudeau government, which aimed to abolish the Indian Act and all treaties, was seen by many Indigenous leaders not as progress, but as a direct assault on their rights and identity. For an elder, this period wasn't about new flags or world fairs. It was about survival. It was about fighting to keep our languages, our ceremonies, and our connection to the land alive. The activism and resistance from Indigenous communities in response to the White Paper was a critical turning point, sparking a modern movement for self-determination and Indigenous rights that continues to this day. It's a reminder that even in a decade of transformation, the journey towards justice and reconciliation was, and still is, a long and difficult one. So, looking back, the 1960s were a messy, contradictory, and utterly transformative decade for Canada. It was a time of incredible nation-building. We got a new flag, a promise of universal health care, and a new, more open approach to immigration. The Quiet Revolution redefined our relationship with Quebec, and Expo 67 showcased a new Canadian confidence to the world. But it was also a decade that laid bare the deep injustices faced by Indigenous peoples, starting a conversation that we are still having today. The Canada of 1970 was profoundly different from the Canada of 1960. It was more independent, more diverse, more socially conscious, and more complex. The legacy of that decade is all around us, in our flag, in our healthcare system, in the multicultural streets of our cities, and in the ongoing struggle to build a more just and equitable country for everyone. The 1960s didn't solve all of Canada's problems, but it was the decade when Canada truly began to define itself for itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey back in time interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into Canadian history. What do you think was the most important event of the 1960s in Canada? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time.